Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first meeting of our 45th season. So wonderful to see a full Westminster after a gap of 6 months. And it's my pleasure, delight, even an honour to welcome two distinguished people tonight. And I'll start off by introducing Sir Jonathon Porritt. As you know, he's a lifelong champion of sustainability, eminent campaigner, writer, commentator. It's not just that, he's given strategic advice on sustainability to many international companies. And as you may have noticed, he was chair of the UK Sustainable Development Committee for 9 years. A certain government decided they didn't need it anymore, which I think was a pity. He's been the founder or president and guide for many organizations in this space over many years. Here we know him as the former Chancellor of Keele University. Less well known is his role on our advisory panel for a number of years, where in many emails I personally have discussed and evolved ideas to look at sustainability in as many ways as possible. And of course, apart from the help he's given on that, if I mention Jonathon Porritt's name to some of the people that we want to invite, that makes all the difference. They take an invitation to Keele World Affairs very seriously. So we're always exchanging emails. He gives thoughtful advice as soon as I ask him. But I regret one opportunity where it was a bit off topic, but I did think I'd send him an email, but didn't get round to it. And it was when I was having my breakfast. When you're retired, you sit there and have your coffee and toast and open the paper, because we have a print paper. It was the Times, actually. I got to that page with the birthday list. Does anyone look at the birthday list? Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? And you see all the good and the great. They put them in A to Z order of surname. But then as they pick one or two or three, put them at the top. They really are outstanding. So when I looked at the paper, Jonathon was one of three who was in this top echelon. And the other two, and it was in the Times, and I'm not making this up, and it must be true. The other two were the former President of the United States, George Bush, the older one, who is still around, and the other one, the third one, was the Dalai Lama. Such is fame. No further introduction is necessary. Moving on quickly, while you process that, and while Jonathon processes it, to Dr. Caroline Lucas, former leader and MP for the Green Party, as we all know. And as I said to her earlier this evening, such a pleasure to meet her finally, having seen her on the stage so many times. And of course, you know that she was the first Green Party MP, and that was for 14 years. And also she had the European Parliament before that. Like Jonathon, she is the winner of Lifetime Awards, more than one. And I was thinking just how challenging it must have been to be a woman and the sole representative of a party in Westminster that even today is a rather difficult environment. But since she ceased being an MP, Caroline's had the headspace to think further about the big issues of the day, and as a result, this has led to her latest book, which I'm told is a Sunday Times bestseller, Another England, How to Reclaim Our National Story. Now, I know that this book, you might be thinking, well, it'll all be about CO2 emissions and those sort of matters, but it's much more about history and culture, and that's what you're going to explore with Caroline and with the help of Jonathon in the next 40 minutes. And what I would encourage you to do, despite the fact you want to rush for a coffee and see your friends, you've not seen them for 6 months, please go to the Nantwich book desk and have a personal encounter with Caroline. of an intellectual nature. And that's my introduction. Over to you, Jonathon.
Well, thank you, Bill. I've been trying for a long time to persuade Bill to stop reading the Times and start reading The Guardian. And honestly, completely impervious to this advice, so he comes up with rubbish like that from time to time. Highly embarrassing. But I'm delighted to be back here, obviously, at Keele. I feel, as you can imagine, enormously close to what happens at Keele all the time. I had a very wonderful time here as Chancellor for 10 years, and every revisit is fantastic. I'm staying in the Marriott Hotel, obviously we're both staying there, and I've now got a room on that side of the hotel that looks out over the wind turbines. Oh. And for me, people who fix up a hotel room with a view over a mini wind farm, you cannot possibly ask for more than this.
I've got the car park.
You've got the car park? You see, Bill, you have to sort this out in future. But genuinely, absolutely delighted to be here. And actually, as far as encounters with Caroline go, and I look forward to all of your encounters with Caroline during the break, we have many encounters. We've worked together for a long time on a whole host of different issues, and not just CO2. I did have to persuade Bill not to worry about that too much. There are only 4 pages in the book on CO2, by the way, for those who've got a bit of an aversion to CO2 and climate crisis stuff. There's not much in it in this book, which is good. Lots of other things that we'll come on to talk about in a moment. But we've been, I suppose, pursuing a more integrated, holistic view of what this whole view of the world looks like for at least 20 years, if not more, 30 years maybe. So it's a great delight to us, I think, both, I hope, checking in quickly, to have a shared conversation. To get the whole thing moving, the ball rolling, as it were, Caroline's just going to give us a little extract from Another England to position why what you're about to have the rest of the evening thinking about is so important for all of us, wherever you might be on any political spectrum.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and it is a real pleasure to be with you this evening. Thank you so much for coming. And yes, I'm just going to read 2 paragraphs, and essentially this is from the preface, and you have to imagine that I'm standing on Westminster Bridge, and I'm just a couple of years ago, and I'm looking back to 2016, and in particular, the morning after the Brexit result was announced. And so I'm just looking back at that time. In one way, that moment on Westminster Bridge feels a lifetime ago. Our country has gone through so much since, and if anything, the alienation and polarization are much greater today than back in 2016. But the truth was clear even then. Brexit was the result of division, and it would make those divisions worse. The fact that England and Wales voted to leave and Scotland and Northern Ireland to stay has put incredible strain on the myth that the United Kingdom is an equal partnership of 4 nations. The government in London decided what form Brexit would take without any reference to the elected governments in Edinburgh or Belfast or indeed Cardiff. Unsurprisingly, support for the reunification of Ireland has grown. The pressure for a second independence referendum in Scotland can't be resisted forever. In Wales, a new sense of national identity is on the rise. The future of the United Kingdom itself is now in doubt. Yet we left primarily because of what happened in England. Outside of the capital, every single region in England voted for Brexit. It's no disrespect to Wales, which voted by a majority of just 80,000 for leave, to say that it was an English vote that drove Brexit. And many reasons have been advanced. It was because of the way communities had been abandoned when so much of our industry collapsed in the 1980s, because of the hollowing out of local democracy intensified under Margaret Thatcher, because the deregulated City of London had sucked more and more investment out of the regions, because the great institutions that we all shared, like the NHS, were being trashed, because the old elites of Eton and Oxford were not only strengthening their grip on the reins of power, but were now looking increasingly to tax havens and Wall Street to better themselves and their friends, and 100 other betrayals. And to be honest, because those who benefited economically from all these changes and from the UK becoming a more open and diverse society, did not do enough to share these gains fairly, and they often sneered at those with a more traditional view of England.
Indeed. Well, putting to one side for a moment the elites of Eton and Oxford.
Present company, except.
Thank you very much. Can't do anything about that now. I think what is so intriguing for me about this book is that we know we're facing deep divisions in society today. We know that you can track them back to certain moments, Brexit vote obviously being a very clear inflection point in how we think about England and how people think about their part in England. Caroline takes us back in the book, much, much further than that, back into many different narratives about what it is that made England, whatever you might think of England today. But through all of it, you are essentially putting to your reader that we are very divided, that our sense of Englishness, whether you come from more the right end of the spectrum or the left end of the spectrum, has been divided for a very long time. And one of the reasons why we're still wrestling with whether or not there's such a thing as Englishness over and above Britishness, and the combination of those two things, is because those divisions are deep and painful and culturally and historically complicated for us to assess. At the moment, what's happening isn't narrowing those divisions. If anything, they seem to be getting wider and wider as we go.
Absolutely. I mean, the past few weeks and months have been just an object lesson, haven't they, with the whole debate about whether or not it's right to fly the flags, where you fly the flags, which flag you're flying, what does that flag mean? I mean, all of that, in a sense, seems to kind of get to the heart of some of these deeper conversations, which in a way aren't happening, but should happen, that we should surface them. And the point that I make in the book, in a sense, is that people for whom an idea of England and Englishness isn't an ethnic identity, but it's an inclusive identity, those people, I argue, need to get out onto the pitch and make that case more loudly so that we can reclaim the flag from those who I think in many cases are using it to signal something different. They are using it to talk about them and us. And I think it's hugely important that we don't just allow all of that space to people who've got a very different view of an ethnic little England. And if we're to challenge that, then we have to get on the pitch ourselves and to put forward a different view of England and Englishness. And my worry is that the left in particular has been incredibly squeamish about doing that. You know, it's almost as if as soon as you talk about England, you're assumed to be talking about whiteness or race or immigration, and all of these issues come up. And so many on the left have just not wanted to talk about it at all. And I just think that's very dangerous, because I think that's what allows, if you like, the far right or the Tommy Robinsons of the world to then claim that flag as their own. And it isn't. And Englishness is not exclusiveness and imperialism and exceptionalism. You know, we've got a huge and wonderful history of Englishness, which I cover to some extent in the book, looking through the lens of literature in particular. But just to remind us of that kind of radical Englishness that we don't really get taught about very much. We certainly don't talk about it now. And yet, unless we do, then it feels as if this moment in history where it feels so fraught at the moment and feels so tense, it feels that if we simply say that we can't get onto that pitch and talk about it, then we cede a huge amount of influence and power to forces that I don't think have the best interests of any of us at heart.
So just to be crystal clear on definitional stuff, a bit boring, but we might as well get it out of the way now. What is the difference between Englishness and Britishness?
Well, it's so interesting, isn't it? Because I don't think, you know, if you imagine that conversation in Scotland, if someone said, what's the difference between Scottishness and Britishness, or Welshness and Britishness, or even Northern Irelandness and Britishness, you know, you would be laughed out of the room because it is so glaringly obvious. And I think what's so interesting about that question now is that it reflects the fact that those of us in England seem to think that Englishness and Britishness are the same thing. And we use the terms totally interchangeably. And one of the really sort of moments when I saw that was when, obviously, Keir Starmer had been told to write an article for St. George's Day. This was last year. And so he'd obviously diligently sat down and written an article for the Daily Telegraph about St. George's Day. But throughout this article, he was mixing up Englishness and Britishness throughout. He was using those terms interchangeably. And it does matter, because unless England can see itself as England, then I think there's this sense that Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland can't fully come to their own potential, if you like, because the sense of Englishness kind of just dominates everything. And I talked about the myth of a United Kingdom of equal nations. And I think at the minute it is a myth. And I don't know how many Welsh or Scottish people there are in the audience, but I would love to hear from you afterwards, because I think for people from Scotland and Wales, you know, this overbearingness of England is a real problem. And one of the things I talk about in the book, which might seem counterintuitive, since I'm kind of saying that in a way it feels sometimes as if England's got the whip hand the whole time, I think England needs its own political institutions so that it can see itself as England. And by that I mean, as well as radical devolution, which we absolutely need because we are one of the most centralised countries in the Northern Hemisphere, I think we also need an English Parliament. I think if we had those institutions that reflect England separate from the other nations of the United Kingdom, we would have a clearer sense of our own identity, we'd have more of a voice. And if we had longer, and if you'd ask me a slightly different question, I would then also go back to say that I think in one way, part of that Brexit vote was a kind of frustration in England that we don't have that political voice. And ironically, in a way, that frustration got taken out on a further institution that's even further away from England. In other words, the opportunity to vote was about the EU. But I think quite a lot of that was to do with a frustration of people not feeling agency and power in their own areas, in their own regions, and in England as a nation state.
Right, just give me a moment to work out what the other question is I'm meant now to be asking, because I've sort of forgotten that one. But just to kind of nail it a tiny bit, Caroline, I mean, we'll come on to devolution and institutions and reform and all that kind of stuff, which won't be as boring as it sounds, by the way, because it is really important. But you are extraordinarily harsh about the success, on the one hand, of the right in commanding all the narratives about what it is to be English, and to have done so not just recently, although it's particularly acute at the moment, because of all sorts of different reasons. But you're also very unforgiving about the failure of the left to find a narrative that would make English people on the left of the spectrum feel good about being English, and not just feel good about being part of Great Britain or United Kingdom, whatever it is. I mean, you're equally mean about both of these things, the success of the right and the total failure of the left. Now, we know that one of the reasons why people on the left struggle with a progressive interpretation of what it is to be English is the burden of imperialism. And I think it's very telling that you, in your preface, talk quite a lot about why we've not managed to handle this story about imperialism. And you quote Ben Ockery, and as you can see, I'm flicking through here now fairly desperately to find the right page number. Can you remember what page number it was?
I think it was at the very end of the preface, wasn't it?
Was it? Okay, let's just see if we can find it between the two of us, because it's a cracking quote, which I feel we ought to kind of share here.
Yes, the last page of the preface.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. So this is Ben Ockery, who, boy, is he a good interpreter of why we're struggling with identity at the moment. And this is what he says. Nations and peoples are largely the stories that they feed themselves. If they tell themselves stories that are lies, they will suffer the future consequences of those lies. And if they tell themselves stories that face their own truths, however painful, they will free their histories for future flowerings. There are so many people on the left who are so deeply concerned and historically ashamed of our imperial history that to find a way of going beyond that into the present moment, let alone into the future of what England might be, has proved pretty much impossible. And I can't point to a single leader on the left who has succeeded in navigating the extraordinary complexity and controversial nature of the post-imperial debate and helped people on the left come to terms with it and move on to what England might be now as a consequence. I can't point to that. And you talk about it a lot, but you don't quite nail how we do that.
Well, I think I give a few suggestions about how we might move in that direction, and one of them would certainly be around education. I mean, I think it is quite extraordinary that Michael Gove, for example, one of your favourite people.
That's irony, by the way. Deep, deep irony.
But it was Michael Gove who changed the curriculum when he was Education Secretary to mean that learning about our colonial history was no longer a mandatory requirement. And so if we don't know that, then it's not surprising that people can't kind of face up to it or understand why the country is as multicultural as it is. You know, many people from ethnic minorities will say, we are here because you were there. And by that they mean that that's how the ties grew up and the English language grew up and the relationships that often go back, tens and decades and longer together. And although I can't point to those politicians for you, I can point to some very good writers who've moved in this space. So I'm thinking of historians like Kojo Koram, Sathnam Sanghera. Both of those have written books in the last few years that are absolutely making the case that unless we face up to our imperial past, which doesn't mean hand-wringing, it doesn't mean guilt, it just means understanding what happened, then we can't necessarily move forward into the future. And they would argue that so many of the institutions of this country, whether that's the power of the City of London or whether it's the opulence of our stately homes or whatever it is, lots of this is as a result of that colonial history, and it's understanding it. And then we can get into conversations, if we like, about what we actually do about it. But if we're not even making sure that's part of our education, then I think we're never going to be able to reckon with that past. And I think we do need to, not in a guilt-ridden way, but just in a way of understanding. Before you launch wars in Iraq, it might be handy to know what the British involvement in Iraq has been for many years. Not a colonial one, but one nonetheless of serious exploitation and domination.
Yeah. Wow, you just triggered my memory of a map that is now circulating on social media of what Palestine looked like in 1947, just before the Balfour Declaration. And if any of you want a bit of historical grounding as to why the genocide unfolding in Gaza right now is both complicated and deeply rooted in our post-war failure to understand a new role, just look at the map of Palestine in 1947. It's astonishing. But anyway, sorry, that was a just instant response to what you were saying. But we're not good at this stuff, are we? We don't seem to be sufficiently at ease with ourselves to engage with that past, complex though it is, without thinking, we can't come out of this without being guilt-ridden. We're going to have to face up to reparations. We're going to have to do all of this stuff. And that blocks us from the future thinking that we now need to move on to. So let's put that behind us. I don't think we've cracked that yet. And Caroline's mentioned education being one of the problems why we haven't. I think another is a lack of self-confidence on the part of politicians on the progressive left. I genuinely don't think they know how to do that stuff. There are so many issues they don't really know how to engage with. So we're stuck in this place now where even to try and engage in a conversation about what a progressive Englishness might look like for the future, and I am coming back to the institutional side of that a bit later, we still don't find an easy way to it. Now, in Another England, Caroline unearths a lot of cultural and literary reminders about why we might feel more comfortable about our origins as people in England today. And that, for you personally, is really important. You've used those literary connections because they matter to you personally, but they also connect people back into different parts of English history at critical moments where we can begin to identify with different things. And if I say that Caroline starts with Robin Hood and ends, what was the most recent historical, literary example that you gave us? Probably 20th century examples.
It's just a few years ago. It was Bernardine Evaristo.
Bernardine Evaristo, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a lovely span of people who help us understand the deeper cultural story. I'm just trying to help you here, Caroline, because I don't want people in the interval thinking they're buying a political tract when they come to the stall, because they're not, or you're not. This is a book rooted in history and literature as much as in politics. And for me, that was massively reassuring about our ability to think differently about our history and the relevance of our history to our present and to our future. It's not just about what the politics of it might look like, but I would like to hear you talk about that because it runs through the entire book.
Yes, and in a way, one of the reasons it does is that is what I know. I studied literature before I ever got to politics, and I love it, and it's what I naturally reached for in terms of trying to understand more about England and Englishness. And other people might do it through sport, or they might do it through nature, so I'm not giving literature a privileged place in that. But having said that, I do think it's just so interesting, for example, if we're talking about, to pick up the conversation around imperialism and so forth. Sometimes the Michael Goves of the world would say that those people who are worried about our imperial past are just being very woke. And so I loved looking back at Shakespeare's Tempest, written in around 1610, where he wrote The Tempest, and you'll remember that's the play about Prospero and Miranda, who end up being shipwrecked on an island, which they think is deserted, but in fact it's not, because Caliban and his mother Sycorax were already there. What's interesting about that play was that at the very same time as he was writing it, I think people think that what triggered that was that there was a boat called the Sea Venture in 1609 that did get shipwrecked on its way to Virginia, where it was going to give more food and replenish the colony that was being set up in Virginia. This boat did get shipwrecked, and people did think it was an uninhabited island, and it was in fact what we now know as the Bahamas. Bermuda. But if you know the story of the Tempest, then you'll know that Shakespeare is pretty critical of people that rock up on someone else's island and stick their flag in it and claim it for themselves. So right back in 1610, we had people saying, hang on a minute, is this, the best way of doing things? Or one of the other themes in the book is around what I would say is a particularly English love of the natural world, and so I trace some of that through one of my favorite poets, John Clare. People might know him as the poet of the enclosures. I mean, he was around at the time when so much of the land was being enclosed and taken away from ordinary people, so they couldn't farm it, they couldn't use it for their animals or to get foraging and so forth. And those poems are so powerful. And to see what was happening to the land of England through the lens of John Clare several hundred years ago, I think can help us trace back what is now a very live movement around land rights in England. And I'm thinking of organizations like the Right to Roam, who you might know have been very involved in trying to expand our access to the natural world. In England, we only have a statutory right of access to 8% of the land of England. In Scotland, by contrast, the assumption is that you have right of access unless there's a very good reason otherwise, and very good reasons would be ground nesting birds or crops just being grown or whatever. So I think some of the literary background that I try to trace in the book is a way of giving us maybe more confidence in some of the movements that we see now in this country, which is trying to push back in terms of the power of elites to have so much land. Remember that I think it's, 50% of the land in England is owned by just 1% of the population. That isn't a new observation. That has been going on for a very long time. And so to see the enclosure movement through, for example, the poems of John Clare is, I think, a way of kind of seeing this tradition of that kind of fight back.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I love that depth. It's really important. However, mindful of the time, Caroline, because Bill's over there, and if we exceed our 40 minutes, as you know, you're never allowed to come back again to a World Affairs lecture. I feel we ought to move on a little bit to the future. And I was wondering how you had reacted to this quite improbable story that the most authoritarian party, the government that I've witnessed for a long time, talking about the Labour government, has chosen to introduce a new bill into Parliament called English Devolution and Community Empowerment. And part of what Caroline is arguing in the book is if we don't get to grips with some of the failures in our democratic system, including devolution, then there's not much likelihood of us cracking this conundrum about Englishness. So are you heartened by the fact that the government has now introduced a bill which has on the front page this notion of devolution for England, and then as a follow-up story, community empowerment, which I have to admit is the bit that excites me. But I'm interested to know if you think we may be about to see something enlightened, and dare I say it, possibly radical, coming out of this hidebound Conservative Labour government.
Well, I would love to say yes.
Oh, go on.
But
try it.
It's a great title. I will absolutely give it to you. It's a very good title for a bill. And clearly it has potential, and it can still be amended, and I hope it will be amended, because frankly it doesn't live up to its title. And I think one of the concerns is that, when you have new powers for bigger mayoral regions, for example, there's a question about whether or not that power is being brought down from Whitehall, tick if it is, or whether it's being sucked up from more local authorities. And my fear is that the way that I'm looking at it at the minute is very much that it's taking the power away from the local level rather than bringing it down from Whitehall. And what worries me as well is that even in those areas where they have taken a vote to decide what kind of local administration they want, and if they want the committee system, which arguably is more, well, not even arguably, self-evidently is more transparent and gives more accountability, because councillors together make decisions and they can hold people to account in a much more effective way. Even if they want that, they're not going to be allowed to have it. They're going to have a mayor for regions that sometimes have no real commonality at all. And I'm thinking, in my own experience, of thinking of Brighton and Hove being kind of locked together with East Sussex and West Sussex, and that just really doesn't make a lot of sense, and people are very worried about that. So you've got that entity, and then you've got potentially a mayor that you're going to struggle to hold to account. So on that bit of the devolution, I'm a bit worried about it. And on the community empowerment, well, I hope we can beef that up. I went and looked at it because we had this conversation a few weeks ago, and there's nothing there about citizens' assemblies. There's nothing there about, it's not really about participative budgeting. There's a bit more about the community right to buy, which is a good thing, but it's not radical, I don't think. So I like the packaging. I like the fact that they're trying to move in this area, but I hope very much we can amend it into something that is a lot more progressive than I think what we have on the table now.
Which will depend on people in their own local areas making sure that it does actually meet those expectations. Because otherwise we're going to go into another period of time where essentially Whitehall decrees what it is that will happen through until the next election, and that will basically be that.
And all of the experiences that unless these kind of more local regions mean something to people on the ground, then there's no kind of interest in them. John Prescott, he tried to spearhead devolution and the idea of a kind of a northeast assembly. And it was roundly rejected because the boundaries meant nothing to anybody, except presumably somebody in Whitehall who'd drawn a red line on a map. But it wasn't organic, and it wasn't cultural, and it wasn't meaningful to the people who lived there.
Yeah, exactly. So we're wrestling still. You can see that there's no easy answer to what Englishness will mean and will contribute to the improvement of the lot of so many people in this country. We can't finish the session, Caroline, without mentioning the dreaded Nigel Farage. I'm sorry. It has to be done. The man seems able to command more media space than is allocated to any other human being on planet Earth. Well, possibly with the exception of Musk and etc. But having watched as Nigel Farage took control of the media space throughout the summer, and now going into the party season and listening to Ed Davey and listening to Keir Starmer and listening to Farage himself, this whole story about what England means to people is at the heart, absolutely at the heart of what party politics is about today. Have you come to the same conclusion that many people have, that Farage is just a much better, smarter politician than anybody else in politics today?
Well, he's certainly a much better communicator, that is without doubt. And he knows that the way that you reach people is via stories rather than dry, abstract facts and figures. And, you know, if we learned anything from Brexit, it was the power of emotional contact, you know. And emotional content, I should say. I was quite involved with the Stronger In campaign. I really hate the title of it even, but the Stronger In campaign, you might remember, was the Remain campaign running up to that Brexit referendum. And I really remember trying to urge the leaders of that campaign so strongly to do so many things differently, but one of the things was that they were framing the whole thing in terms of economic transactions. You know, so we were banging on about the fact that your supermarket trolley of food was going to cost you X amount more, which was certainly true. But on the other side, they were talking about taking back your country. They were talking about who you are and what you feel and your emotional contact and your culture and your identity and your meaning. And we're banging on about a bit of economic transactionalism. And until the left get onto the space of meaning and identity, then we're in a really bad place. And we've got to stop being so squeamish about it. And the reason that I'm so harsh on the left, or mean in your words, is because I think by that abdication of responsibility, we are handing over so much influence to the right, who have no difficulty in getting into this space.
Yeah.
So I think it is massively important that we learn those lessons and we stop talking to people as if they are kind of economic calculators themselves and recognize them as living, breathing people with families and roots and blood going through their veins, and recognize that what appeals to people is something that can be far more visceral than what fits on a balance sheet.
So one of the great things about sharing this space with Caroline for many years is not only do I know a bit about her current book, but I know a bit about her next book, which is in the making, obviously. And the next book is all about Nigel Farage.
It's not really.
Not really. But her next book is all about this notion of populism and how we make some of the ideas that are current amongst people who really, really desperately want to see a different kind of politics shaping a different future for people today. How that needs now new narratives to make it compelling as anybody who might be seizing hold of the faux narrative of Nigel Farage's populism. Your book is going to be about what populism might mean in a very different, very fraught age. Will that help us understand what it means to be English at such a difficult time?
It's a very interesting question. I'm only on about page 20, so it's early days, but I hope it will. But I hope as well that it will also give us a better understanding about how we challenge the oversimplification of the populist message, if you like, because life is messy and complicated. And anybody who tells you that it's all black and white and there are very easy answers is probably not telling you the truth. And I think rather than just raging at the populists that we don't like when those messages are ones that we don't much like, I think it's much more important to take a step back and work out what is it that those populist messages are feeding on. You know, what is it in terms of people's feelings of isolation, of insecurity, of mistrust, of unfairness? Let's try to understand that a little bit more and try to address it, rather than just thinking that the people who are falling for the kind of populist messages are somehow, you know, less intelligent than the rest of us, which is incredibly arrogant and something that I think that, again, the left has been guilty of in the past. So I think we need to understand complexity and be happy with complication. And if I can just come back to literature for one moment, I think one of my favorite 4 words in the whole of Shakespeare is from King Lear, where Gloucester says to Edgar, "And that's true too." 4 little words. And that's true too. You know, more than one thing can be true at the same time. I am not sitting here trying to tell you that England is the best country ever. You know, I don't think it is, and I don't think patriotism means that you do have to think it's the best country ever. You just need to give a shit about your country, to quote Billy Bragg, and to want it to be as good as it can be. But that sense of understanding that England can be rubbish in some things and good in others, and sometimes we love it and sometimes we hate it, that's all fine, and that's complicated, and that's how life is. And if we could just say, "and that's true too," rather than immediately taking up our polarized positions, then we might have a better hope of some kind of more positive future.
Oof. So,
Thank you.
as they say in the business, Caroline has got to the peroration 2 minutes early, which is very unhelpful. But nonetheless, it does, I think, remind us that there are massively important things to be focusing on here. And I hope that it's been helpful to just have 40 minutes to remind ourselves that behind all of these different issues about the climate and about justice and equity and nature and all the rest of it, there lurk these really, really deep cultural questions about how we find the best interpretation of ourselves in very fraught, difficult times. And we do it through tolerance and pluralism and a sense of recognition of the value of other people. For me, that is a supremely important political message at this particular time, even as it is construed against the difficulties that we face right now. Go for it. You've now
1 minute.
got...
1
yeah,
minute.
you see, this is brilliant. We're working this. We're under the strictest possible instructions you can imagine. This little clock here, Bill, it's devastating.
Yeah, I need the seconds going down now because I'm not quite sure where they are. But I was simply going to say the importance of storytelling within all of that.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think sometimes we could be deploying stories better than the way that we do. So, for example, when you had in the Leave campaign, you know, people standing on the cliffs of Dover and talking about plucky little Britain and how we were able to kind of see off the enemy in the Second World War all by ourselves, just calmly and gently pointing out that 1 in 10 of those RAF pilots were actually from occupied Europe and were refugees, might just remind us that we have had a lot to thank refugees for a heck of a long time.
Indeed.
Still,
I know, but happily,
we're all right.
we now know, Caroline, after Donald Trump's speech to the UN General Assembly, that we didn't really play any part in that whatsoever. Happily, it was all done courtesy of the United States of America, so celebrate that little irony as well. Okay, so we have, as you know, because you're all very familiar with the process here this evening, we have a break now, and Caroline will be out there, wherever it is, signing books. I shall be mingling, hopefully, having a chance to chat with you, and then we'll reconvene in 20 minutes. Bill will join us, having sifted some questions, and we will then move into the second half of this evening, which will be more of a Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. I am going to do my utmost to do justice to your many questions that have been stimulated by our two distinguished visitors. And I'm going to start off in the area of Englishness. So, Margaret Wilson, and this is for Caroline, apparently. You state in your book that we need to reclaim Englishness. And what, in your view, does Englishness look like? Have you got any further remarks to add to this?
Yes, well, thank you, Margaret, for the question. And I often think about this, because obviously if I keep banging on about England and Englishness, I ought to have a sense of what it looks like. And I think the thing about it is that it can look like a different thing on a different day of each week. I mean, I don't think it looks like a fixed thing. And I just want to pick up on something that kind of has come up in the conversations I was having while I was signing books, which is that when I'm talking about the English identity, I'm not asking people to choose between a British identity and an English identity, or an English identity and a London identity, or a Stoke-on-Trent identity. I think we can all have multiple identities. And in that same way as we can have multiple identities, we can have multiple ideas of what England and Englishness looks like. So to me, personally, if I think of England and Englishness, I think of, if I'm thinking about values, then I'd probably think of fair play and cricket on a Sunday afternoon. I would. I mean, there are stereotypes that you come up with, and I come up with that. I come up with Morecambe and Wise, come to that. I also come up with The Lark Ascending and Shakespeare, But I also come up with the English football team, which I think is just a wonderful example of multicultural England. And, it's probably the best example that we have of different nationalities coming together and being united literally under an English flag. So I think that England and Englishness is what we want it to be in many ways. I don't want to be sitting here giving you a prescription of what it is, but I think it's one of those things that is very personal, but you can also find, as with the football team, moments when we all come together with knowing what it was. I'd love to ask Jonathon what it is for him, though, since he's sitting there scoffing, saying, "What? Really?"
No,
so what does England and Yes, you were. What does England and English
I'm just
mean
wondering,
to you?
I'm just amazed you mentioned English football.
Why?
Well, because none of the people who play for English football teams...
That's the point.
Oh, I see. I might have mentioned the Red Roses to be rather more opportunistic and populist in my response.
Well, those two answers actually lead me nicely into Tim O'Malley. We are a diverse population. They're not all born and bred in Stoke-on-Trent, are you? Yeah. Tim O'Malley. I'm 95% Irish and 5% French, according to my DNA. Born in this country, I feel British, not English or Irish. I feel it is so important to know your own history. I therefore propose that "Who do you think you are?" should be compulsory for everyone to find their true identity. Does that conflict with what you've been saying?
I don't think so at all. I certainly don't want to persuade someone who is, 90%...
95% Irish.
95% Irish. I'm not going to sit down and try and persuade someone who's 95% Irish. They should feel themselves English, obviously. But I like the kind of theme of what that question was asking, which is that sense of wanting to know who we are. And I get the sense that that interest in genealogy is something that is growing. And I know it's partly because with the internet now, it's that much easier to trace back your family history and to know where you came from rather more literally than perhaps we've been able to before. But I don't think it's only because we now have the technological means to do it. I think there is a sense of in a hyper-globalized world, perhaps it becomes more important to us to kind of feel our roots and to know that kind of that local rootedness. And it feels like that sense of wanting to know where we're from very literally through the genealogy is akin to different kinds of movements that you see with, local towns and villages having their own apple days and resurrecting old festivals that perhaps had gone into abeyance, but now are part of what makes up a local identity in a local place. So I think it's all part and parcel of a kind of renewed sense of wanting to feel that rootedness, which may well, I think, come from the idea that now with so much being globalized, we just want to hang on to some sense of belonging, which I think is so important.
I don't know whether Brendan Walsh is challenging you with his question, but following on. So he's asking, how would you, in a simple way, describe Englishness, perhaps contrasting it with what you wish it to be, but compared with how it currently is? Is it possible to
Well, I
consider
think
that?
that's not dissimilar from the first question in a way, because I hope you don't think I'm kind of avoiding the question, but I don't like the idea of sitting here literally on high, defining a sense of Englishness for everybody else. And of course, I could tell you what I would love Englishness to be, just as I would love, the world to be. But I think I've kind of answered it in the sense of talking about some of the values which I think you can perhaps say are Englishness, but without any sense of exceptionalism or saying that there wouldn't be other nations of the world that would quite rightly lay claim to those same values.
Sorry, no, I didn't mean. I meant I think that last point is so important. I mean, politicians are often asked what they think they mean by English values, and for me that question was tainted by the answer given by Norman Tebbit, and then I think rendered such a false approach to this. I don't believe there's such thing as English values. I think there are values that universally will be expressed by people of good faith in every country all around the world who believe in human nature at its best, subscribe to the idea of living well individually and collectively. I do not believe there's anything about values in England that is unique, let alone exceptional. And in the book, Caroline does go to splendid lengths to demolish the myth of English exceptionalism. And I did enjoy those passages.
I think maybe English traits would be a better way of talking about it rather than English values.
I agree. I would go along with that. Yeah.
Let's look at it in a sort of flag-waving way. I've got several questions. I'm going to read them all out, and then you just give us a quick thought in response. So, Robin Dawson, if God, king, and country are the foundations of English or Britishness, what do we have left? God, nobody believes anymore. That's not true, but that's what he's saying. King is only he's tabloid fodder. And a country, if it's devolved, so where does that leave us? So that's his query. Right, Moira Stannistreet. Should the national anthem only be sung at British events? And what would you suggest we sing for England? Linda Sherwood is on about she thinks changing the anthem might help in separating the sense of Englishness from that of Britishness. And other nations have their own, so why doesn't England? Moreover, the national anthem is self-evidently not about Britain. Discuss.
Woof. Well, on the issue of anthems, actually, I do explore this in the book somewhat, because I look at Rule Britannia and make the distinction between that and something like Jerusalem. And Rule Britannia, as it says on the lid, is very much a very kind of jingoistic, we're ruling the waves and we're, subjecting and subduing other countries. Whereas I think Jerusalem would be my choice of more of an English anthem, because what I love about Jerusalem is that it's a wonderful, stirring song, but it's also, I think, about trying to make this country the best it can be. It's not saying it already is, but we are committed to building Jerusalem on these green and pleasant lands. And so it is that sense that we've got a job of work to do. It's not ready-made. It's not, in Boris Johnson's kind of, world-beating rubbish. It's about saying that this is a place that we love and we want it to be as good as it can be. So that's where I would go with that. And on the God, King and Country, hopefully with devolution, that doesn't mean that you are demolishing the idea of a nation state. I don't think that. I want to talk about multiple identities, and I want to understand devolution within the country of England and then within the United Kingdom. So I don't think those are in contradiction. And I think, I am a Republican. I'm sorry about the King. I would preferred to see the rule of law or democracy or some other set of values there. And I think that's going to be just as potentially motivating as saying God, King and Country.
Do you have anything to add, Jonathan?
Well, I'm not a Republican because I'm no great supporter of alternative systems, which I think at the moment demonstrate to us the frailty of any country that calls itself a democracy and then is subject to some of the things happening in the world today. So for all its failings, I'd rather go along with the idea that there is from time to time enough of a benign expression, manifestation of royalty, which I think is the case with this particular monarch, to make it preferable to a Republican president who could go completely AWOL in the way that they are all over the world.
The royal family is not immune from going AWOL.
No, but it's limited by the fact that it actually doesn't have much constitutional power at all, thank heavens. Anyway, we're not going to fall out. No, we're not. We're not going to fall out.
We should fall out. It's good. It's good debate. It's very vigorous. And when you see the fact that that the monarch has in the past been able to change tax arrangements and so forth in order to be able to benefit their own estates, I think that there is still a role, unfortunately.
But that's not going to happen today. Anyway, it doesn't really. Honestly, when I look at the democratic renewal challenge for this country, top to bottom, which is massive, and not just captured by a bit of temporary reform of the House of Lords, it's a through transformation we require in every single level of what it is that makes people feel good about being active citizens in England or Great Britain. I look at that and I think right at the top you've got this kind of ritualistic discussion about whether we're going to be a republic or a continuing monarchy. And I think, I don't care about the cherry on the top of that democratic renewal cake. What I really care about is full engagement to get our democracy working again. And the tiny little bit at the top is, to me, almost an arcane self-indulgence.
On the other hand...
the
other hand, that cherry on the top owns one hell of a lot of land.
Yes, true.
That cherry on the top is also extremely wealthy. And those are issues that I think we cannot ignore.
I quite agree.
You can, because...
No, I don't ignore them. But do you know what percentage of the land owned by that cherry on the top is managed according to the strictest ecological principles? No, you don't, but I do.
If you two
we digress.
We finished. Definitely done that one.
I'll move on to another question. And I'm going to talk more about devolution, and a general one, and then something a bit more specific to make it concrete. So Linda Mottram, devolution can be seen as quite divisive. So she's asking, would that lead to the breaking up of the United Kingdom? Now, you actually, in your talk, suggested otherwise, because to get the English represented. But she's wondering about dispersion of the four countries. I mean, that has been that was an issue, was it not, in previous phases of devolution with Scotland and so on. So how would you answer Linda Mottram?
Well, I think there are forces already out there which are driving the four nations of the UK further apart, irrespective of anything to do with devolution. And I'm thinking of the fact that, notwithstanding the travails of the SNP right now in Scotland, the support for independence still remains at around 50% of the population, and it's not impossible to imagine that there could be another referendum in the next, 10, 15 years that could swing that to be in favour of Scottish independence, particularly if, I might say, we have a Prime Minister Farage at Westminster. And that is, again, sadly, a perfectly plausible outcome at the moment. So already you've got that. In Northern Ireland, you've got Sinn Féin now, and the First Minister, Michelle O'Neill, has again said very clearly that she expects before 2030 for there to be a referendum on the island of Ireland about reunifying the island. And again, it's perfectly possible to think that might go that way. I don't imagine Wales is going to leave any time soon, but nonetheless, even in Wales, there is a new sense of national identity on the rise. So I would simply say that in all of these other nations of the UK, there are live debates about the future of those countries. And it's just fairly typical that in England, we just bumble along, assuming that everything's going to be fine and not even having the conversation. So I don't think it's going to be devolution that will be driving these countries apart. In actual fact, I think that if you had more powers for a Scottish Parliament, and if you had more powers for a Welsh Parliament, Welsh Assembly, and so on, you might well be able to have a situation where you have a federal United Kingdom that keeps together in a way that is less likely if you try and sit on all of the powers in London and don't give more of them away. So on that kind of macro level, I think that if your interest is in keeping a United Kingdom at least at a federal level, then the way to do it is to make sure that those constituent countries of the United Kingdom have more powers so that they're not going to be kind of, pushing to have greater independence and be there on their own.
Before I ask Jonathan to come in, now let me just follow up with Tim Hiscock's question. You mentioned the idea of an English Parliament, but how could this be created without creating a strong rival to Westminster, given that obviously the English population is 80% of the whole? So are we going to have two huge rival camps, or are you going to put the English Parliament somewhere in the Lake District?
Well, I would love to put the English Parliament somewhere that isn't London. Quite honestly, I would, because the whole issue around the centralisation of England is that everything is in London. All of the investment goes into London. And if you compare it to countries like Germany or France, there's a much more dispersed sense of power centres around those countries, rather than putting everything in London. So I don't know about the Lake District, but certainly I'd go as far as, Manchester or Birmingham or Leeds, I don't know. And I think that in terms of how that would sit together with a parliament for the United Kingdom, is that you could imagine things like foreign policy are not going to be necessarily decided at the English level. That, rightly, it seems to me, looks like something that you would decide on the UK level, whereas those other issues that are currently devolved to Scotland and Wales, like health and education, could quite rightly be done in an English Parliament. So I don't think it would be that difficult to separate them out, and not least because we've already had, I don't know if you remember, it got cancelled by Boris Johnson, but for a while there was this thing called EVIL, which stood for English Votes for English Laws, and it was a way of trying to address the so-called, what's it called, that problem, a Scottish name? West Lothian question, thank you very much, sorry, it's late, which is, about why is it the case that that Scottish people can vote on English on issues that don't affect Scotland, but we can't do the reverse.
Yeah. Have you got anything to add, Jonathan?
No, I'm unlike the cherry on the top. I'm completely at one with Caroline on this. I think with one minor variation, which is I'm not too worried about the idea of an English Parliament for the time being. I'm much more focused on the idea of the House of Lords and what we need to do to get rid of the House of Lords and create a second chamber which will speak to this much more inclusive, pluralist notion of what the UK as a whole stands for. And if we can do that, then I think that in the process of doing that, and that's very unlikely to happen in the short term, I have to admit, but if we can do that, then the discussion about what the English contribution to that second chamber would look like and how we'd organise voting into that second chamber will become a very live issue. And at that point, we might begin to think about a separate parliament for England. But I've not given a thought to the Lake District or Leeds as a place for the English Parliament. I am really focused on getting rid of this wretched House of Lords as it exists at the moment, because I think it, as a function, does some good things along the way when dealing with autocratic stuff coming out of the Commons, but we have to get that sorted now.
I mean, I agree about the Lords, although it is quite ironic that at the minute, if you look at legislation going through the two houses, it is the House of Lords, which is the one that is standing up for things like the right to peaceful protest and, certain democratic norms that we might have expected to have to have been able to take for granted. But just very quickly on the English Parliament, if I could just give one other explanation for why I think it's quite important, and that is because I want progressives to get there before Nigel Farage does. I don't want Nigel Farage to be talking about an English Parliament and then us being manoeuvred into having to feel that we have to oppose it because we don't like the sort of Parliament that he has in his mind. So I would rather we got there first and designed it in an inclusive and progressive way rather than having a kind of fight over it into the future.
Could we step down a level in the nuts and bolts of this sort of pyramid below Westminster? Sarah Anderson said, do you think it's practically possible to have regions of a size small enough to create a sense of belonging and ownership, and large enough to do anything meaningful in transport, health, and education? And Peter Holdcroft, slightly different question. If we want to devolve power to towns and cities, how do we encourage turnouts of more than 20%, which is so typical? If not, is this democracy?
On the issue of turnouts, I think one of the ways that you could increase turnouts would be to increase the powers of the authorities to which you are electing people. Because again, there has been such a centralization of powers, so many powers taken away from local authorities in recent years. And increasingly, I mean, I know I used to be a member of a local authority, and I've also observed what's been happening in Brighton and Hove up close. And more it feels as if local councillors are just an outsourced arm of government whose role is to make the cuts that the government would rather not make themselves, so they outsource it to local authorities and cut their budgets left, right and centre. So it's the local authorities that get it in the neck when your local library has to close, or when you can't keep open old people's homes or whatever else. So I think if people felt that those local authorities had greater meaning, then that might just increase turnout. I think if we had a fairer voting system, that might just increase turnout as well. On the other issue, I might defer to Jonathan again here, because I think getting that balance between the Goldilocks question, so it's not too hot and it's not too cold, and it's not too big and it's not too small, and getting that sense of belonging but the sense of agency, I agree that that's going to need some care, and I would love to know what some of the best examples are of that. But I would have thought one way of addressing the kind of the belonging bit of it, and indeed maybe even the agency bit of it, would be to think more imaginatively about what kinds of democratic accountability we're going to build into these kinds of authorities. And I'm thinking of the role of things like citizens' assemblies, where you can have so-called ordinary people coming together and having a big say in what they want for their communities. And I think if we could actually trust people more with a bit more power than the current system normally does, we might have a better way of ensuring that whatever kind of constellation geographically we end up drawing, that it does have a stronger kind of sense of ownership from the communities around it.
Mm. Absolutely agree. Totally agree with that. It's when you look at the jigsaw that you'd have to kind of make in such a way that it created order and involvement and empowerment for people. It's a complex process. I felt that the regional structure that the Labour government created up until 2010, which consisted of regional assemblies with none of the powers they should have had, because unfortunately John Prescott's scheme for that fell foul of some pretty vicious infighting in the Labour Party. Regional development agencies, regional health authorities. I know that we're not going to do right by a proper constitutional outcome for England until we allow regions to have their level of involvement, to stop Whitehall micromanaging everything, literally everything, right down to what each individual council is doing. And I've sat on the Regional Development Agency for the Southwest for 10 years, and it was one of the best things I've ever done. And I was here a lot in the Northwest, got very involved in the Regional Development Agency for the Northwest as well. So I know that level's important, but on everything else, I completely agree with Caroline, because we have to find ways in which this participation story speaks to people very powerfully. I'm probably less liberal about this than Caroline is. I'm a great supporter of compulsory voting.
No, I'm with you.
And if you don't want to vote, then I'm going to fine you because
As long as you can say none of the above.
you can say none of the above, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I want to start with that because then people go, oh, God, okay, well, I better get my head around this, and then cascade that through the system. And I think that would help. I'm not saying it's the answer, but I think it would help.
And I think votes at 16 is a
Yeah.
good thing. And
Yep.
hopefully that will also trigger more education in schools so that people know what they are, making their mind up between, and getting that engagement from a very young age, I think, can only be something that's positive.
Let's look a little more broadly. Some of the members are looking outside the UK for comparators that might inform your argument. So, I mean, these are just a couple of random ones. Ian Duerdoth, Germany seems to have reinvented itself, he says, after the shame of the Second World War. Are there any parallels that would help the UK or England? And Dave, he doesn't give you a second name. Are we moving more towards a more federal Britain? In other words, are we becoming, or would we become a United States of Britain? So, with the briefest of looks at the United States of America and a look at a country like Germany, would you like to sort of comment on the thoughts you've been expressing today?
Well, I don't think I'd call it a United States of Great Britain. That wouldn't be, or United Kingdom. That wouldn't be my choice. But I think we probably could be looking. I mean, it comes back to that earlier question, to be honest, doesn't it? Around whether or not giving more powers to the different nations of the UK would make it more or less likely for the UK to hold together. And I think it would make it more likely for the UK to hold together. But I do think that there is going to be an ongoing clamour for more powers, whether that's at a national level or whether it's regional or more local. So a brief answer to the question, do I think that there is a move towards a greater federation, then my answer is yes. On Germany, I mean, there will be much better qualified people than me to answer this question, but it does strike me as interesting that there was, I think, a very deliberate strategy of building up cities in different parts of the country. So there isn't that sense of so much concentration of wealth and power in just one place. I mean, at the very least, you've got Bonn, and then you've got Berlin, and then you've got those big cities that have got far more powers, like Munich and so forth, far more powers than any city has in the UK outside of London. So I think there is that sense of a dispersal of power that I think is very interesting that we could learn from. And I also think what we could learn from probably is when it comes to the reunification of Germany, just the amount of money that was put on the table to try to make that happen. And I think, it's obviously not been perfect, but I think it was an extraordinary thing actually when you look back at just how much finance was put on the table to try to bring East and West back together. And as I say, I'm not by any means saying it's a perfect solution, but it just demonstrates, when we've got all of these kind of phrases about levelling up or about, trying to heal the North-South divide, I think we need to be very serious about the amount of money that we really need to be putting on the table to make that work well.
I've neglected the microphones. Has anyone got their hand up? I've got lots of questions, but is anyone burning to have the microphone downstairs or upstairs? Right, one member here, thank you. I'll put while you're waiting, I'll put this question. You're ready. Good to go.
Hello, thank you for your talk. Would you not think that before we look at our national identities, we should focus on whether we are all citizens of the same world, having to look at the same planet?
I'm not was the last bit of what you said having to look at the same planet? Yes, but I hope they're not either or. I mean, as you'll know, as someone who's been in the Green Party for the last 40 years, then trying to make sure we have a livable planet and one that we all take responsibility for is something that motivates me hugely. And we haven't talked very much about the environment and climate and nature tonight, but that doesn't mean to say that that isn't, in my view, and I'm sure in Jonathon's too, the most important thing, which is the prerequisite for all of this, because we can have as many conversations as we like about how we organise, governance structures, but if we don't have a livable planet on which to do that, then, we're wasting our time. So I certainly agree with you that, if I've understood your question rightly, and apologies if I haven't, but the overriding necessity has to be recognizing that we are all on one very small, fragile, precious planet, and we all need to be taking a hell of a lot better care of it. And just in the last few days alone, there have been even more causes for concern, and I'm thinking of the announcement this morning from the Conservative Party to say that they're going to rip up the Climate Change Act, which is an act of extraordinary vandalism. I mean, the Tory act of tearing it up, not the Climate Act. It's economically illiterate, but it's also totally betraying future generations, so that's a disaster. And then when it comes from the Labour conference, I was on the PM programme a couple of days ago because some journalists had been speaking to some industries who seemed to think that they had heard that there was going to be a green light for Rosebank and Jackdaw. Rosebank and Jackdaw being two of these big oil and gas fields. Rosebank is the largest undeveloped oil and gas field in the North Sea, which would, again, be pretty devastating. So, yes, we need to take care of our planet first and foremost.
Can I pitch in on that one? So when I was a little boy, a long time ago, we used to have a lot of fun. I used to find a lot of fun when you were kind of telling people where you lived. And I'm sure a lot of you did this. It was a nice, innocent thing to do in those days. And you start with your own address, the street that you lived in, and then the town or whatever it was that you lived in, and then you'd put England, then you'd put United Kingdom, and then, because my parents were quite liberal in those days, we'd put Europe. Oh my God, that's dodgy these days. But anyway, you put Europe, and then you'd kind of go down, you'd put the world, and then you put the universe. I stopped at the universe because I think that was probably enough. Weirdly, there was never any complexity about that. It was just completely obvious at the age of 8 that I, as a tiny little fragment of humankind, lived at all of these different levels, and that they were all stitched together in one way or another, and it was really important for us to be able to make sense of who we were in each of those different levels. And I still think, in a way, writing out envelopes to yourself, which tells you you're a citizen of planet Earth, and indeed of the universe, if I dare say this, isn't a bad exercise. Which obviously brings me to Europe. Because what Caroline has just mentioned there is we are heading into some very, very difficult times on the climate crisis. And the only way we're going to address those difficult times is when we get much better at sharing sovereignty, where we agree to work as collectives, as people, and eventually, of course, it's blindingly obvious, we as a human species will have to learn how to come together as a species to address the climate and nature crisis. The thing about Europe, which we, both Karen and I, fought furiously for at the time of the Brexit vote, is that although it seemed as if we'd given away sovereignty, what we'd actually been able to do since the Second World War was to fashion a sense of shared identity and purpose, which enabled us to address much bigger issues. And there is no dealing with the climate and nature crisis if we don't learn the art of pooled sovereignty, of shared sovereignty. And that's something we're bringing back. I'm sitting next to the Vice President of the European Movement, so I know that Caroline's doing this really hard because, the EU isn't working terribly well at the moment, but I can tell you it's working a lot better than many other places in the rest of the world.
Upstairs, I think is Connor there? With the microphone, yeah. So if you have upstairs, if anyone wants to ask a question with the mic, Connor is in the corner. And I'm going to move on to a question from Sean King. I'm bringing up the I word, immigration. So Sean asks, is, in the context of what you've been saying, is immigration a problem, a benefit, or just a tool used to divide us?
Wow. Well, it's certainly being used as a tool to divide us at the moment. That is for certain sure. And I think that, I think first of all you need to kind of separate out the different levels of immigration. So again, quite often it's convenient for politicians who don't much like immigration to roll together illegal immigration and legal immigration and asylum seekers and non-asylum seekers and then just make a big mess of it all. So I want to say, first of all, loudly and clearly that I am proud of our history and record of being a place where people can seek safety and sanctuary as asylum seekers, and I want that to continue. And I think the proposal now that that we would be clamping down on things like indefinite leave to remain and potentially sending people back after they've been here for 10 years or 20 years is just preposterous. And I worry that Labour is now in a bit of a battle with Reform to kind of be as tough as they are. And things like family reunion is one of the most natural things in the world, it seems to me. If you're talking about immediate family and you have managed to get here and sought sanctuary, then the idea that you wouldn't be able to reunite with your family in a way feels to me just wrong. When it comes to legal migration, and we're talking about economic migration, I think it depends on the sectors you're talking about and the numbers you're talking about. I mean, I think that it's very, very clear that right now our public services depend hugely on people coming to work in our NHS and in our care homes, and we ought to be very grateful that they do. I know the arguments about brain drains, and so, I also think we need to be training up more of our own people to do more of that work. But until we have, I think we should be grateful that there are others coming to do this. I can feel Jonathon sort of heaving slightly because this is an area where I think we probably do disagree somewhat. So I will pass the floor to him.
No, we don't disagree on anything you've said. Couldn't agree more.
Okay.
Because I feel I'm worried very worried about the tenor of the debate about the role that migrants to this country have played, are playing right now, and the degree to which the well-being of literally every single citizen in this country depends on people who've come to the UK to add their bit to public services, in particular through the NHS and the care system. It just astonishes me that we've got apparently a generation of politicians who think they can make a speech about immigration and never mention that those public services would completely fall to pieces if we hadn't been able to attract those people to come and make life better for most citizens in the UK. I just simply don't understand it. I really don't. So I'm completely with you on that. I know that where we might differ is in terms of the future problems that we face, just because as things get more fraught in more countries all around the world, and we were talking about the climate crisis, boy, we're going to run into some absolutely horrific migration challenges. So we need to get our act sorted out completely now so that we can do right morally and politically by recognizing the level of migration that works for people in this country, works for asylum seekers and refugees, and works above all for those people who've come to this country in good faith to add what they know they can add to the well-being of this country, and they want to make that work for this country. So there's no clash between us at all at the moment. I'm worried that politicians seek to prove their rectitude in this area by chipping away at the European Convention on Human Rights and stuff like that, which is just playing to the kind of audience you really don't want to spend much time with.
And there is just so much scapegoating as well, isn't there? Which is just a way of diverting from the fact that, we haven't been building enough homes for years, enough affordable homes, or we haven't been investing enough in our public services. And this idea that, the person that you need to be cross about is the migrant who may or may not be in front of you in the queue for the NHS, when in the reality, the migrant is probably the person who's actually treating you when you get into the NHS. It would be good just to remind some of those politicians who I think are just stirring up so much hatred and division in such an irresponsible way. And I can't help feeling, if only there was sort of, a group of countries quite close by, that we could actually sort this out with together. Yeah, if only. If only.
How do you square that entirely moral viewpoint with the problem of capacity? Have we got space for unlimited numbers of people coming from troubled countries, and can we provide the infrastructure to support them? Because there are many right-thinking, considerate people who are concerned about that.
Yeah, which is where I think Jonathan's point about getting our act together now is just so important, because the kinds of figures that people are now suggesting of people who may well be on the move as a result of climate collapse is just phenomenal. And unless we begin to think about that now and think about ways of working with other countries to try to manage it, I think the impact could just be overwhelming and hugely damaging. So we do need to do a heck of a lot, and partly that's about playing our part in terms of trying to mitigate the worst of the climate crisis, and we certainly don't do that by tearing up the Climate Change Act, for example, and we do it by showing leadership, for example, at the big climate talks that are happening in Brazil in November. We do it by putting some serious money on the table. The North is always being kind of berated for the fact that we promise money to the countries of the global South for them to be able to do their best to adapt to climate change, and yet we never actually get that money on the table, and yet we know those countries of the global South are the least responsible for the climate crisis, and they're the ones likely to be on the front line first. So we need to do far more when it comes to trying to enable them to live in those countries for as long as possible in a thriving way, rather than having the horrendousness of having to leave and to be on the move. But at the same time, I think we also need to recognize that people will be on the move. And so how do we deal with that as a global community? And right now, I don't have a lot of hope when I think about how politicians are going to step up to that enormous challenge.
I'd like to switch to politics. It's not the main reason you're here, but it's inevitable, isn't it? So these are a couple of questions about the current ruling party. And so, I imagine not everyone was gripped in front of their television watching Keir Starmer's speech to his conference. So you may not know the detail. I read about it in that dreadful newspaper that I mentioned earlier today. So I have a slight understanding. So, Julie Colclough, was Starmer's conference speech a step in the right direction in relation to the character of Englishness, or has it further blurred the lines? I expect you're familiar with this speech, so you might be able to enlighten us. And then there's sort of a little postscript from Richard Moulton. Communication. Could Andy Burnham do it better? So if you just would like to work your way through that.
If I can do them in reverse order. I think Andy Burnham does do it better. I mean, I think he does talk human. I think there's something about his manner and just the way he connects with people that is a lot more personable than the way Keir Starmer does. But more to the point, in a sense, as well. I also think the fact that Andy Burnham is a fan of proportional representation, and that he wants to put more money into public services, and that he appears to be willing to consider things like wealth taxes, are all good things. So on the policy side of it as well, I would prefer a Labour Party led by Andy Burnham than one led by Keir Starmer. In terms of that speech, I think that he defended. If I was trying to be dispassionate about it and not bring my Green Party hat to bear, then I think he did do a good job of trying to infuse people with the good things that Labour has done, because Labour has done some good things, and I'd rather a Labour government than a Tory one or a Reform one, and I think it behoves us to recognise that they are doing some good things, and it's very easy to forget that because they don't talk about it very much, and there's quite a lot of bad things that kind of go into the other side of the ledger. But I do think he gave a bit of hope, which was important. I do think that he defended Labour's record. What I didn't find very authentic, and which annoyed me, but that might just be me, is the fact that they'd obviously given out all of these flags for people to wave, and at some sign they all had to sit in their seats and wave them. And I don't know. I just think that this conversation we've been having about national identity runs deeper than just wrapping yourself in a flag to make a political point. I found that slightly. It turned me off, to be honest, and I would be interested to know, for people who don't follow it quite so closely, what they felt about it. But it just felt so manipulated and inauthentic. So in terms of whether he advanced the case for England and Englishness, I'm not really sure. He demonstrated that there was a form of patriotism that could be progressive, I think, which was important. But then he accompanied it with, more stuff about how we're going to be stricter on immigration and quite a lot of other things which did not enthuse me.
I'm going to move to the Green Party, and you'll both be able to talk about this. This is a good curved ball warning, okay? I'll put them both together, but they're different. Jeff Pettingill, what do Caroline and Jonathon think of the new leadership of the Green Party or its direction of travel? There's an awkward one for you. So I'll read the other one out while you're thinking up your answer. And then Chris Nibbs. We don't get Green Party members here at World Affairs together very often. It may well be, it's probably the first time. So how come, I don't know why he says this, but he says, how come the Greens have a stronger presence in Europe than in the UK, if that is true? So off you go.
Well, on the first one, I don't think it's that much of a curveball. I mean, I think it's self-evident that Zach Polanski, the new leader of the Green Party, is doing a pretty great job in terms of communicating Green Party policy, growing our membership. We now have more members, I think, than the Lib Dems. If you add the Green Party of England and Wales with the Green Party of Scotland, which is separate, but if you added up their collective membership, there's now more members than the Lib Dems. I think 20% of that membership was put on just in the month since he's become leader. I would love him to talk more about climate and nature, and I'm hoping that he is about to. And maybe he's making more of the pitch around being, a party of the left because he's anxious to see off the potential threat. I mean, I don't really want to use the word threat. Corbyn and Zara Sultana are perfectly entitled to set up another party on the left. But it is also the case that for as long as they are arguing about what it's going to be called and who's going to run it, it's actually quite good news for the Greens because we're hoovering up some of those votes in the meantime. So I think he's doing a good job. I think he's a great communicator. I just want him to talk a bit more about climate and nature, but I'm sure he will very soon. And on why aren't we doing so well as countries in Europe? Well, this is a source of huge frustration to me because the Green Party was the first Green Party in Europe, the second in the world after New Zealand. And indeed, the German Greens came to the Green Party of England and Wales, or the UK Green Party as it was then, to kind of get inspiration for their manifesto. But because they've got proportional representation and because they've got state funding for political parties, they were able to take off while we were still running jumble sales to try and get enough money for the deposit for people like Jonathon to stand back in the 70s. So it's all very frustrating. But I don't think there's anything in the waters in Europe that means that people are automatically more likely to vote Green in the rest of Europe than they are here. But I think they have a fairer voting system and I think they have funding for political parties.
Jonathon, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, no, I mean, the frustration for the Green Party over 50 years now about our electoral system is manifest. I mean, the great thing that happens now is that as a Green candidate at the local level, if you organize your campaign properly, you have a real prospect of getting elected. And we have 870, roughly, local councillors, and that's mostly done by just good politics, planning a campaign, getting people out, knocking on doors, talking about what the Green Party stands for, and then proving that at the local level the Green Party can make a real contribution to the lives of people in that local area. So there are ways of overcoming the first-past-the-post system. At the local level, it's just incredibly difficult at the national level. So we relied on Caroline for a very long time. 2024 was a breakthrough year when we got 4 people into Parliament, all of them now proving their worth in terms of their representation of what green ideas and green values, how we do politics, looks like. Everybody in the Green Party is very focused on that. And now we can add Zach to the mix. And yeah, that's going to be really interesting. I think in the interest of full transparency, we should probably acknowledge that both Karen and I were supporting the rival candidates, as it were, and didn't necessarily think that Zach had proved that he could be the leader the Green Party needs now before the election. Karen and I have talked about this since, obviously. I really like the way that Zach has stepped up and done some of the opportunistic legwork that you have to do as a party leader. I love the fact that Ed Davey and Keir Starmer now have space in their political calendars to attack Nigel Farage. Good. They've been sitting watching Nigel Farage for the best part of 2 years. Neither of them, up until very recently, like 2 months ago, had actually taken the time out to write a speech saying, "This man is a toxic incubus in the body politic here in the UK." Nobody in their parties had said, "Go for it," because that'll help people to understand what Nigel Farage really stands for. That Zach Polanski, for the last 2 years as deputy leader of the Green Party, he's been whacking him, Nigel Farage, day in, day out, all the time, saying, "Do not trust a single word that spills from this man's mouth, because you really shouldn't. Understand that he will undo much of the benefit that would come from a more progressive politics in this country. And every time he says he's on your side, rest assured that as a multimillionaire, concerned only about what he needs to do to make himself a political mouthpiece for a set of ideas that are completely abhorrent." Sorry, am I overdoing this a bit? I hope not. Anyway, for me, watching Zach take on Nigel Farage and say, "No, you cannot make those comments and expect to get away with them just because most of the right-wing, most of the media here in the UK are right-wing media that will just allow you to spout this rubbish." So Zach has created space for blessed Ed and poor old wooden Keir to come up and say something vaguely sensible about dealing with Farage in this country. So I'm currently giving Zach a lot of support, because he warms the cockles of my heart every time I hear him do this kind of stuff. He's got a lot of stuff to prove, though, from now on. He's doing the easy bit now. He's got to sort out a lot of stuff internally in the Green Party, and then he's got to deal with the nature and climate stuff, as Caroline said.
Yes,
that's a non-party political point, you understand.
Yes, thank you. I want to say two things. We're going to run about 5 minutes late, so I hope that's all right with everybody. I also want to say, if there are members of the Reform Party or adherents to it here, we don't ask anyone to put up their hands and declare their political affiliations ever at a Keele World Affairs meeting. But I'm just sorry that there isn't time to give you the opportunity to push back. Right, just a slight diversion for you, Caroline. Just a quick word, because I think this is close to your heart. So Pat Blencarn, I think it is, it's about culture that you've been mentioning. It feels as though there's a current perception that science and practical education is of more value than arts and humanities. But then, what of the effectiveness of storytelling and the power of ideas? How distressed are you about the state of education?
On a scale of 1 to 10. Well, I am very distressed about the way in which the arts are being downplayed. And it feels to me as if, things like, you'd expect me to say English literature, but things like English literature are more important now than ever. And the reason that I say that is that I think what our world needs more of is imagination. Imagining what it's like to be that asylum seeker who is going to put their child in a boat because the sea is safer than the land that they're coming away from. I think in the end, political failure is a failure of imagination. And, if I had a prescription to give to the front bench of all parties, it would be to read more poetry and fiction and cultivate your imagination, because that is essential for a humane society. And I worry that that is being downplayed in society today.
I've now got a question that both of you might like to comment on, and this is from Ian Watson, and I'll try to express it as well as I can for Ian. If you had a story for Britain, and maybe he means England as well, in the 21st century, how would it go? He says, the Americans said we had lost an empire, and not found a role. So in the context of this evening, and everything you've said about Englishness, what is our role in the new world order? Would you like to start? Or do you want to start?
No, I definitely don't want to start. Sorry.
I think just lobbing that question in at 25 to 10 is deeply unfair.
I know, I always try to end with a big question.
Well, I mean, to try to answer it, I think that it would be good if we had a realistic assessment of who we are as a country. In other words, I do worry somewhat that we think that we're more important than we are. And that doesn't mean to say that I'm doing us down. I want us to be a decent, tolerant, democratic, compassionate, kind, thriving country. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to spend yet more money on nuclear weapons, for example, to show that we are somehow as macho as everybody else around that table. And it doesn't mean that we, necessarily have to, have the seat that we have on the UN Security Council, frankly. That seems to be very odd to me that we still have that. That ought to be an EU seat, I would have thought, but still. So I think having some kind of humility about our role at the same time as recognizing that, there are incredibly good and important things we can bring to the table. For example, the British civil service is recognized to be one of the best in the world, the way that they're trained and the way in which they do their jobs. And when we left the EU, I heard time and time again from other EU diplomats how sad they were and how much of a loss it was that they didn't now have as many people from the British civil service working alongside them. So in what I'm saying, it's not to downplay what I think we can bring to the table, and I think there are all sorts of things we can bring to the table, and of course our wonderful culture and music and arts and all of that as well. But I think it could perhaps start with a more realistic assessment of our powers as a small to medium-sized country in the northwest of Europe. There's total silence.
I'm wondering whether there's anything that Jonathon would like to add.
Whip them up with some excitement. I've just really deflated them.
No, I think...
Yes, fine.
I mean, honestly, I completely share that view. I mean, I feel proud to be a citizen of this country, but there are so many reasons that I'm reminded of why we shouldn't be too proud, why we're just, as Caroline said, quite a small country trying to make sense of our post-imperial past, not making a very good job of that, and trying to work out the contribution that we can make to a world as it potentially fractures at every point. So was I proud of the fact that the UK was the first country to come up with a Climate Change Act and demonstrate what it meant to bring people together around the sense of a shared endeavour to reduce the emissions from our economy? Yes, I really was. And the fact that the rest of the world said, "Oh, how did you people do that? Really? You had a cross-party agreement to create a new Act of Parliament with all this kind of trappings that went with it?" That gave me a sense of, bloody hell, we can still do this geopolitics, this kind of complex diplomatic stuff. And I did feel at that moment that we had the potential to earn our credentials in this new world as it gets more complicated. Since then, I must say, Bill, it's got a little bit harder. But hey, otherwise, I'm completely in agreement with Caroline, which is why you all should have clapped enthusiastically.
Yeah, well, you can clap in a minute. I've got a question before I give you the question you were really hoping for to end the evening. And that is, are there any books left?
4.
Are they still waiting to...
That I don't know.
Yeah, well, there may well be an opportunity for some of you to buy the last 4 books from Caroline in a few minutes. And the final question is from Joe Sexton, which is, how can you spread your warm and beautiful message more widely?
Oh, thank you, Joe. Well, by being invited to meetings like this. So thank you so much for your indulgence this evening, and it's been a real pleasure. So thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Jonathon Porritt and Caroline Lucas.
We did it.